Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Wikileaks founder, Julian Assange, is tonight in prison following his arrest at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he'd been living for the past 7 years after asylum was withdrawn. Mr. Assange first took refuge there to avoid extradition to Sweden over sexual assault allegations, which have since been dropped. He now faces potential extradition to the US over the leaking of government secrets. He made headlines around the world in 2010 when Wikileaks released footage showing US soldiers shooting dead Iraqi civilians. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale has this report.
This was the moment Julian Assange's 7 years of self-imposed asylum came to an end. Older, greyer perhaps, but still defiant, still protesting. After the Ecuadorian authorities revoked his asylum and allowed in the police to arrest him for breaching bail. Inside, he resisted the officers, shouting, "This is unlawful, I'm not leaving," before they handcuffed him and led him outside.
What we've shown today is that no one is above the law. Julian Assange is no hero. He is hidden from the truth for years and years. And it is right that his future should be decided in the British judicial system.
This afternoon, Mr. Assange was brought to Westminster Magistrates' Court. He gave a thumbs up to supporters outside, and inside he waved to the public gallery. But the judge called him a narcissist with a laughable defence and found him guilty of failing to surrender to the court in 2012. He was remanded in custody and will be sentenced at a later date. Mr. Assange is also facing conspiracy charges in the United States relating to a massive leak of government secrets almost a decade ago. Outside court, Mr. Assange's supporters insisted they would fight on.
This sets a dangerous precedent for all media organisations and journalists in Europe and elsewhere around the world. This precedent means that any journalist can be extradited for prosecution in the United States for having published truthful information about the United States.
The Wikileaks website that Julian Assange founded has, over the years, published hundreds of thousands of secret military and diplomatic documents, many from the US, revelations that government officials argued put lives at risk.
See all those people standing down there?
Perhaps the most remarkable leak was this video of a US Apache helicopter firing on Iraqi civilians and 2 journalists in 2007, information that Wikileaks insists it had every right to publish.
This pertains to publishing work 9 years ago, publishing of documents, of videos of the killing of innocent civilians, exposure of war crimes. This is journalism. It's called conspiracy. It's conspiracy to commit journalism.
In 2010, Mr. Assange was accused of sexual assault in Sweden, charges he denied but eventually avoided by seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Can you hear me?
From his diplomatic bolt hole, he continued to campaign and defend himself, but eventually he outstayed the welcome of his Ecuadorian hosts, in particular the new president, Lenin Moreno.
Con sus obligaciones en el marco del derecho internacional. El señor Assange violó reiteradamente disposiciones expresas de las convenciones.
To some, Julian Assange is a champion of free speech. To others, a dangerous conspiracy theorist. Either way, after almost 7 years in that building, he's now at least facing justice. This afternoon, Mr. Assange left court by a back entrance for a new life of confinement, this time at the hands, at the very least, of the British government. James Landale, BBC News.
Well, our North America editor John Sopel is at the White House for us. And John, it looks as if the US might now finally get their man.
Yes, and if he is extradited, Julian Assange will face a single charge of conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. In fact, that sounds rather dry. Well, what it boils down to is this was one of the biggest breaches of classified information in the history of the United States, with Julian Assange allegedly co-conspiring with Bradley Manning, a former Navy defense analyst, into breaking into those computer systems. Now, his friends in the United States are saying very much that this was the act of a whistleblowing journalist, not a computer hacker, and he should be protected under the First Amendment, which gives the right of freedom of expression. Now, the Department of Justice may regard him as a fugitive from justice, but it's probably fair to conclude that here in the White House, with this president, it's a little more ambivalent, because in the presidential election campaign, Julian Assange played an absolutely critical role with the dump of thousands of emails that were deeply embarrassing to the Democratic Party. Now, Donald Trump, in the last few minutes, has been asked about his arrest, and he says, "I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing." In October 2016, he said, "WikiLeaks? I love WikiLeaks."
John, many thanks. John Sopel there.
The WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is in custody tonight after being arrested for allegedly breaching his bail conditions. His 7-year self-imposed exile in London's Ecuadorian embassy ended dramatically this morning after his asylum was revoked. Mr. Assange also faces possible extradition to the United States in connection with the release of tens of thousands of secret government documents. His supporters are calling it a dark day for journalism. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, has this report.
In the end, he did not walk out. The police walked in at the Ecuadorian's request. 7 years self-imposed carry-on concluding in an angry carry-out.
No one is above the law. Julian Assange is no hero. He is hidden from the truth for years and years. And it is right that his future should be decided in the British judicial system.
But he knows the real issue is international. The police soon said Mr. Assange had been further arrested in connection with a US warrant for computer-related offences. However, Ecuador's president insists there's a deal. The UK can arrest Julian Assange, but not send him on to any country which tortures or executes prisoners, i.e. the USA.
Solicité a Gran Bretaña la garantía de que el señor Assange no sería entregado en extradición a un país en el que pueda sufrir torturas o pena de muerte. El gobierno británico lo ha confirmado por escrito, en cumplimiento de sus propias normas.
Foreign Minister Alan Duncan later confirmed the UK has agreed this deal. Ecuador's government accusing Mr. Assange of breaching their trust in him in a variety of ways. Here's one.
Toleraron cosas como que el señor Assange.
They tolerated things like Mr. Assange smearing feces on the embassy walls and other behaviour like this.
Mr. Assange jumped bail 7 years ago in 2012 seeking refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. And why? Because he was wanted then in Sweden for alleged rape and sexual assault, which he denies. The charges were later dropped. But Mr. Assange feared Sweden would send him on to the USA. And America's interest lies in a vast slew of confidential military documents WikiLeaks has released down the years. America claims the caches of videos, secret emails were stolen. They accuse Mr. Assange of conspiring with whistleblower Chelsea Manning to break into secret US military computers.
Julian Assange is not being pursued to protect US national security. He is being pursued because he has exposed wrongdoing by US administrations and their military forces.
WikiLeaks uncovered an extensive spying operation against Julian Assange within the Ecuadorian embassy.
All of which explains perhaps yesterday's sudden press conference in London by WikiLeaks and Mr. Assange's lawyer. Dripping with irony, here was WikiLeaks, yes WikiLeaks, complaining about an invasion of privacy.
Since Lenin Moreno took power, that Julian Assange has been living in a sort of a Truman Show-like situation inside the embassy. It has been a total invasion of his privacy.
Meetings with his lawyers, supporters, his doctor, covertly taped and videoed, they said. And they allege the Ecuadorians sent this material to the Americans.
WikiLeaks. It's been amazing what's coming out on WikiLeaks. Did you see another one? Another one came in today. This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove.
Heady days, the US presidential campaign, and WikiLeaks suddenly dumps thousands of Hillary Clinton emails all over the election campaign.
WikiLeaks! I love WikiLeaks.
But today, oh no he doesn't.
Do you still love WikiLeaks? I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing.
These days, WikiLeaks whistleblower Chelsea Manning is back in prison for refusing to give evidence. President Trump has Robert Mueller's still secret report investigating alleged links between WikiLeaks and Russian hackers. And last year's sealed indictment against Mr. Assange is sealed no longer. Few divide opinions like Mr. Assange and WikiLeaks, crusading fearless publisher or handler of stolen goods. Today the Ecuadorians just got themselves off a massive hook, and the British just got themselves on one. Honour their deal with Ecuador or kowtow to America.
Well, now joining us from central London is Julian Assange's lawyer, Jen Robinson. Jen Robinson, it's a long journey between arrest and actually getting to the United States. I mean, will the British authorities cut short their interest in Julian Assange, do you imagine?
Look, it seems that we've got a provisional extradition request from the United States. They're seeking his extradition and prosecution for his publishing activities with WikiLeaks. And it remains to be seen. We'll be back in court in the next month to see what the US is going to request him for. We certainly do not think that the British government ought to be extraditing a publisher for having published truthful information, and no democratic government ought to be complying with such a request.
Well, now, he skipped bail here originally over charges involving sexual abuse in Sweden. Presumably Sweden has no interest at all, and that now is dead.
First of all, there were no charges in Sweden. It was a preliminary investigation in which he was never charged. That investigation was closed. This case has always been about, and his concern in seeking asylum in the embassy was always about, the risk of extradition to the United States. Today, that concern that we've been warning about since 2010 has unfortunately been proven correct. So we don't expect there to be further information from Sweden. As far as we understand, that case has been closed. We would fight it, and his Swedish Defence Counsel is confident of having a strong defence in that case. The key concern now is, as it has always been, is the United States.
Well, extradition is a big number. I mean, is it something you can win, or is it an inevitability?
It remains to be seen. We will be fighting this extradition request. This raises key free speech concerns and ought to be a matter of concern for all media organisations and journalists outside of the United States. This effectively means that if you receive information from a source and you publish truthful information about the United States, then you could face extradition and prosecution in the United States. That's a terrifying precedent, and this is one that all of the media ought to be standing against.
But of course the United States sees it rather differently, don't they? They're absolutely furious about the scale of what they regard as really deeply secret issues have been leaked.
What they're furious about is having revealed for having engaged in war crimes, in human rights abuse, and about corruption. Those are public interest disclosures for which WikiLeaks has won numerous journalism awards, including the Amnesty Award, including the Economist New Media Award, including the Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism in Australia Award. This is a free speech issue, and all of the media organisations who also published Chelsea Manning's material ought to be very concerned about this precedent and ought to be standing up for the people that made those publications possible.
But there are other issues. The emails leaked during the 2016, particularly the Hillary Clinton's emails during the 2016 Democratic election.
That is a separate publication for which there has been no indictment and has no connection whatsoever with the extradition request that's made today. The extradition request from the United States relates solely to the material that was released by Chelsea Manning in 2010. That's material that was published, I believe, including by Channel 4, including by The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, El País, and newspapers around the world, including in the United States. So this is a very serious matter for press freedom.
Well, Jen Robinson, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll be watching developments with great interest. Thank you.
Ecuador accused him of discourteous and aggressive behaviour, of violating international norms, and said their patience had run out. They called in the British police, and with that, Julian Assange was out, after nearly 7 years holed up in their embassy. He emerged, bearded and pale, and was in court, charged and found guilty on one count, all by the afternoon. That related to his decision to skip bail back in 2012 rather than answer sexual assault allegations made in Sweden. But the bigger question is whether the UK will extradite him to the US. Assange faces conspiracy charges over the whistleblowing website he co-founded, Wikileaks' exposure of classified documents. Today, Jeremy Corbyn tweeted, "The extradition of Julian Assange to the US for exposing evidence of atrocities in Iraq and Afghanistan should be opposed by the British government." And he shared a video of a 2007 US attack on Iraq. So, Is this an assault on free speech or right and proper treatment of a man with questions to answer? Here's James Clayton.
Julian Assange's situation was bizarre. A man who'd skipped bail and sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. But it's worth revisiting the Assange phenomenon. Nearly a decade ago, the organisation he founded, Wikileaks, published a massive tranche of classified US government documents. Assange had shone a light into the murky secrets of war. 7 years later, he was carried out of the Ecuadorian embassy, an undignified end to years of diplomatic house arrest.
Mr. Assange will now have the opportunity to contest the charge against him in open court and to have any extradition request considered by the judiciary.
The Ecuadorian government had had enough of him, not helped by recent WikiLeaks publication of leaked documents from the Vatican. Mr. Assange will now fight extradition to the US. It's worth taking a moment to remember why. In 2010, after several high-profile leaks from the US military, WikiLeaks decided to publish a huge data release of classified information, given to the organisation by whistleblower Chelsea Manning. Karen von Hippel was working for the State Department at the time.
There was a huge panic when people found out that the cables were going to be released. All these subcommittees were set up to read through and try to figure out, how to respond to it. Everyone was very nervous. They were nervous about sources and methods, about people potentially being hurt because they were talking to the US government.
For supporters of Assange, though, it was a simple case of public interest journalism.
I think WikiLeaks was changing the world in 2010, 2011. Not only were they bringing forward information of undoubted public interest, it has significantly expanded public understanding of diplomacy and the way the world works, but behind the scenes.
For his loyal supporters, this was an act that would solicit revenge from the US. In 2012, the UK Supreme Court ruled that Mr. Assange should be extradited to Sweden to face questions over rape allegations he denies. Hanging over him was extradition to Sweden and potentially the US.
The difficulty with Julian Assange's case is that there has always been a sense from the very beginning that the United States wanted him. And one of the things that has affected both the issue with regard to Sweden and subsequently has been his resistance to being taken to America to be put on trial by people, significant political figures who described him as a terrorist.
In 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign was rocked by embarrassing leaks published by, yes, WikiLeaks. By this point, even some of Assange's supporters were worried that WikiLeaks was playing into the hands of Trump.
The other flashpoint was 2016. As it happens, I think there's a pretty good case for publishing the documents WikiLeaks did during the US presidential election. Clearly in the public interest, lots of US media organizations, other media organizations were very happy to report on them. What made things much more difficult, in my opinion, was some of the online presentation around it and the impression that WikiLeaks was happy to accept the praise and maybe promote elements in the American far right.
Others ask why WikiLeaks is so obsessed with America over other powerful countries.
It has not attacked, let's just say, China and Russia in the same way, although I can imagine they may have had access to similar personal and private or secure information from those countries. It's sort of interesting that it's all coming from the United States. And of course, as we know from the 2016 elections, that they were targeting Hillary Clinton and not Donald Trump.
In many ways, Julian Assange's legal battle, a battle that has already lasted 7 years, has only just begun. But with so much media scrutiny, his former lawyer believes he'd struggle to get a fair trial in the States.
Whether he could get a fair trial in the United States tomorrow or next month or next year is highly questionable. And so the British courts are going to have to make very careful decisions about all of this.
I'm joined now by Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, and by Alan Mendoza, who is the executive director of the think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. And let's start with you, Jennifer Robinson. When was the first that you, or indeed Julian Assange, more importantly, when was the first point where you realised time was up? Was it just this morning?
We, of course, had a leak from a high-up Ecuadorian official last week that was provided to Wikileaks, warning that there was an agreement between the UK and Ecuador for his arrest. Ecuador denied it, but that was proven today. I got the news just after 10 o'clock this morning that he had been arrested. Apparently, he'd been called in by the ambassador, provided a letter and told that his asylum was revoked, and immediately British police officers were extraordinarily invited into the Ecuadorian embassy.
I mean, you've made this all day about freedom of speech, but, I mean, he isn't being charged with anything related to that. He's being charged with hacking, effectively. So how can you make this about a sort of great big thing to do with freedom of speech?
What he's actually been accused of, in terms of the provisional warrant that we've received, and I've had sight of today from the United States, is conspiracy with Chelsea Manning, who is the source of WikiLeaks publications, the source of collateral murder, Afghan and Iraq war logs, US cables. This is solely a free speech issue because this is about the ways in which journalists can engage and publishers can engage with sources. This is all about the ways in which journalists can communicate with their sources and how that process happens in terms of how you receive and obtain information from sources. This is a free speech issue, and that's why free speech groups in the US have been out criticising the US indictment today.
And Ecuador appear to have made clear that they had an agreement, or they have an agreement with the UK government. It's a bit unclear. What do you understand? Is it that they won't... The UK government has agreed not to extradite him to a country that allows the death penalty, or won't extradite him to a country where he'll face the death penalty? Because clearly, under this charge, it's a 5-year maximum prison sentence, as I understand it.
This assurance that Ecuador is relying upon for having revoked the asylum does not reach the standard that is required of them under their international law obligations. And an assurance against extradition to the death penalty, the UK doesn't extradite to the death penalty in any event. What asylum was granted for was to protect him from extradition to the United States. And Ecuador, having expelled him today and putting him at risk of US extradition, we know that's now what's going to happen, is precisely what the asylum was originally granted for. So the assurance that's been given by the UK to Ecuador does not get there in terms of international law.
And is it your fear that once he gets there, they could add different charges? Or I heard an extradition lawyer talking today saying that wouldn't be possible.
Well, they have time now to... it's a provisional warrant, so we're waiting to see what the final extradition request will look like. But at this point, what we know is it's conspiracy with Chelsea Manning associated with publications back in 2010.
I mean, many people would say this is a man who's not a responsible journalist. He did endanger lives. He did release... WikiLeaks released all sorts of material unredacted. The journalists, the publishers that he worked with, were more cautious, more responsible. They redacted the material. He is not a journalist. This isn't about freedom of speech.
Of course it's about freedom of speech. If it weren't for the publications that WikiLeaks made, none of those news organisations would be able to have had the publications that they've had. And even though he takes a more robust publication policy, it is...
endangering people's lives.
This is the line of the government. There is not any evidence that any individual person has been killed or harmed as a result of WikiLeaks publications. There is absolutely no evidence for that.
She's right, isn't she, Alan Mendoza? I mean, you know, he's a journalist publishing a story that was true and in the public interest. This is unjustified.
Journalists are not allowed to break the law in obtaining their material. The warrant that we've had, the sort of request for extradition, is quite clear. I know Jennifer would like to push it onto the freedom of speech issue, but it isn't. It's about hacking a military computer at the end of the day. It's about obtaining information they were not entitled to in order to leak it. Now, there's clearly an argument for how things get leaked to journalists. That's one thing. But you'll know from the phone hacking scandal here, journalists cannot break the law in pursuit of a story. And the issue here is, has he broken the law or has he not broken the law on this very narrow charge? It's not gone into free speech. It's not gone into the First Amendment.
Perhaps deliberately has not gone into free speech. But
well, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because you then get away from this argument about free speech and focus on
But they wouldn't be prosecuting him if they weren't angry and very, very irritated by the fact that he published all sorts of material that they didn't want the rest of us to know.
If he has broken the law in publishing that material, there's plenty of precedent for journalists going to jail for acting illegally in that way.
So why do you think this prosecution is valid?
I think it's valid. Well, firstly, we don't quite know the nature of what the British government will say. It's a provisional warrant so far. We don't know the end result of what the American government will say in terms of what it actually wants. But I think it's quite clear that Mr. Assange has spent many years evading justice, hiding in a room in Knightsbridge. He's claiming it's because he doesn't want to be extradited. Let's remember why he went into that room in the first place. It was to avoid being spoken to by Swedish police over rape allegations. Yes, the case was dropped. We hear today they may look at reopening that case again, or one of the cases. So he was hiding from Swedish justice. He then evaded British justice by going to the Ecuadorians. The Ecuadorians now claim that he broke his agreement. Again, that can be disputed, but you need to get the Ecuadorians onto their side of the story there. Isn't it time he actually answered questions in a court of law on these issues?
But isn't it also true? Isn't it also true that what he always said, what Julian Assange and all his supporters always said was, I'm in here because if I come out, I'll be extradited. It looks pretty cooked up, doesn't it? That out he comes into court straight away. Oh, but the US has already, served their extradition. It looks like it was manufactured, planned in that way, which is what he always said would happen.
Well, of course he said it was going to happen because it was obvious he needed to be questioned for his part in hacking computers and other matters. These are legitimate concerns that any country would have, that we would have if it was happening here as well. He needs to, be able to be called to answer for his actions there.
And Jennifer, what do you think about the fact, what Mr. Mendoza is saying, that actually what this was about was a man trying to evade justice relating to sexual assault allegations in Sweden, nothing to do with WikiLeaks in America?
We have made clear from the very outset that he was always happy to answer the allegations in Sweden. This case is and has always been about the risk of extradition to the United States. That's why he went into the embassy, asserting his right under international law to seek asylum, not to evade justice, to protect himself from US extradition. That's what we've been worried about, and that's what we've seen today. Precisely what we warned about. He was right all along. The moment he was taken out, there is a US extradition request. And this is a question of free speech. It is a question of free speech.
We're not done with this now because this is, of course, a story full of twists and turns. Though today's legal proceedings didn't mention the 2016 US election, many Americans think Assange has questions to answer on that front. Back then, President Trump welcomed the helping hand being offered by Assange, though he had a very different message today.
WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. This WikiLeaks is like a treasure trove. Another one came in today. And as I was getting off the plane, they were just announcing new WikiLeaks, and I wanted to stay there, but I didn't want to keep you waiting.
All you have to do is take a look at WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks.
I know nothing about WikiLeaks. It's not my thing.
Well, one person whose emails were published on WikiLeaks is Sidney Blumenthal, the former senior advisor to Hillary Clinton, and he joins me from Washington. Mr. Blumenthal, what was the impact on that, do you think, of having your personal emails, your emails published?
Well, I can tell you about one incident involving me, and then I can speak to the question of the consequences of Julian Assange's collaboration with the Russian intelligence operation that U.S. intelligence says was intended to aid the candidacy of Donald Trump. In my case, what happened was that I had written an email to John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and it was hacked by Russian intelligence. It was passed to WikiLeaks, which then distributed it to the media. Assange, of course, had worked with Russians for years. That email that I'd sent to John Podesta, who I'd worked with in the Clinton White House, by the way, was an article from Newsweek about the Benghazi investigation. It was a critical article about the Republican investigation of Hillary Clinton. And that article by a Newsweek reporter, interestingly, within hours, made its way to Sputnik News, the Russian state media operation, in a distorted way, attributing to me the critical words about Hillary Clinton that the reporter had written, and then within hours, coming out of the mouth of Donald Trump on the stump on October 10th, 2016, just weeks before the election, saying that there was an advisor to Hillary Clinton who was slamming her about Benghazi. It was a completely false flag. It was a false operation, and this falsehood involved the progression of material from Russian intelligence through Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and then to Donald Trump.
Of course, I mean, he's not, as we know, if he is extradited, it's not over any of the things you've mentioned. It's actually pretty, plainly about a hack. As a former journalist, as somebody who knows a lot about this, I mean, do you believe that he should be tried in the States for what they're accusing him of?
Well, this is a criminal charge. I've read the indictment, and it doesn't have anything to do with his relations with journalists. It involves criminal hacking. But let me do say that he does bear responsibility for Donald Trump in the following way. There were 2 batches of emails that were hacked by the Russians and then passed by WikiLeaks. Assange collaborated and knew that he was collaborating with Russian military intelligence. One was the Democratic National Committee emails. The second was campaign chairman John Podesta's emails. The effect of that was the following, that Bernie Sanders voters felt that somehow the election had been rigged because some of the emails showed DNC staffers privately emailing each other critical of Sanders. And that had the effect of diminishing Sanders supporters for votes in the general election across the board, and votes also for the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, who had attended a Russian-paid event sitting at a table with Vladimir Putin.
And just sorry to interrupt, but just...
That had the effect of driving the key 77,000 votes in the swing states that turned the election to Donald Trump, who lost the election by nearly 3 million votes popularly.
And just quickly, you know, the leader of the opposition here, Jeremy Corbyn, has tweeted today saying that the UK government should block this extradition because Julian Assange exposed wrongdoing. Quickly, what do you think of that? Do you agree?
Well, if he wishes to be prime minister and work with the United States under any president, then he needs to respect the rule of law in the United States and as understood in the UK.
Sydney Blumenthal, thank you so much. And of course, Jennifer Robinson and Alan Mendoza, thank you so much for coming in.